The chandeliers of Faircross Hall burned gold above 300 guests, and none of them noticed the moment the Duchess of Aldridge stopped breathing. She stood near the tall windows with a glass of champagne going warm in her hand, watching the crowd part for a woman in emerald silk. The woman laughed at something a viscount said, tilted her head, and lifted her hand to touch the pearls at her throat. That was when the light caught it. A ring. Small, oval, a cluster of seed pearls around a single sapphire the color of a winter lake. The Duchess had seen that ring every day of her childhood. She had watched it turn on her mother's finger, while her mother read to her by the fire, had held her mother's hand with that ring pressed cool against her own palm the night her mother died. She had buried her mother without it, because by then it was already gone, stolen from the dressing table 2 days before the funeral, and no one had ever found who took it. Now it sat on the hand of Vivian Carow, the woman her husband had been seen with in 3 separate cities over the past year. The Duchess did not drop her glass. She did not gasp. She only stood very still, the music swelling around her, and understood that everything she thought she knew about her marriage, her mother's death, and her own quiet, careful life was about to come apart. Her name was Margaret, though very few people used it anymore. To the staff, she was Your Grace. To her husband, when he bothered to address her at all, she was My Dear, said the way a man says it when he has stopped seeing the person he is speaking to. She had married Julian Aldridge 9 years earlier, when she was 20 and he was 28, and the arrangement had made sense to everyone but her heart. Her family needed the alliance, his family needed her dowry. There had been a garden in early summer, a proposal delivered like a business transaction, and a wedding that the newspapers called the loveliest of the season. For the first 2 years, she had told herself that respect could grow into something warmer, that a man who brought her flowers on Tuesdays and asked about her day, even distractedly, was a man learning to love his wife. Then her mother had taken ill, then her mother had died, and somewhere in the grief that followed, Julian had stopped coming home for supper, then stopped coming home most nights, and Margaret had learned to fill the silence of Faircross Hall with correspondence, needlework, and the slow, careful management of an estate that was legally his. He had not gone looking for evidence of the affair. It had found her instead, way these things always do, in a torn theatre ticket left in a coat pocket, in a perfume that did not belong to her on a coat collar, in the particular silence of servants who know something and have decided loyalty. By the time she confirmed it, 6 months before the ball at Faircross Hall, she had already grieved the marriage the way she had grieved her mother, quietly, in rooms no one else entered. What she had not expected, what no one could have prepared her for, was to see her mother's ring on another woman's hand in a ballroom full of people who still called her Julian's happy wife. She set the champagne glass down on a passing tray, without looking at the footman who took it. Across the room, her husband was in conversation with 3 gentlemen from the shipping consortium, laughing at something, entirely unaware that his wife's whole understanding of her life had just cracked down the middle like river ice in spring. Margaret watched Vivian Carow a moment longer. The woman was beautiful in the way that made other women's husbands forget their vows, and other women's friends forgive them for it, dark-haired, quick-eyed, dressed with a confidence that came from being watched, and enjoying it. She did not look like a thief. She looked, if anything, faintly bored, the way people look when they have gotten exactly what they wanted, and found it smaller than expected. "Your Grace!" The voice belonged to Mrs. Blank. Aldous, her lady's companion, a woman of 50 with sharp eyes and a gentler heart than she, let on. "You've gone quite pale. Shall I fetch you some air?" The ring, Margaret said so quietly that Mrs. Aldous had to lean in. "On Miss Carrow's hand. Do you see it?" Mrs. Aldous followed her gaze, and her face changed, the recognition arriving a half-second behind Margaret's own. She had been in the household 11 years. She had dressed Margaret's mother for that final Christmas. She knew the ring as well as Margaret did. "That cannot be," Mrs. Aldous whispered. "It was stolen," magistrate said. "I know what the magistrate said." Margaret's voice did not rise. It never did. That was the thing about her that people mistook for coldness, when, in truth, it was the opposite. A woman who had learned so young to carry grief without spilling it, that stillness had become her only language for pain. "I intend to find out how she came to be wearing it tonight." Not tonight. Margaret watched Vivienne laugh again, watched her rest her fingertips briefly against a passing gentleman's sleeve, an intimacy so casual it had clearly been practiced. "Tonight I am going to smile and dance twice with the Baron's son, because it will please my father-in-law, and I am going to give nothing away. But I promise you, Mrs. Aldous, this will not end in silence." The older woman studied her a long moment, then nodded once, the way people nod when they have decided to follow someone into difficult territory without being asked twice. "Then I am with you, Your Grace. Whatever it takes." The evening continued. Evenings like that always do, gilded and hollow, and Margaret Aldridge danced and smiled and let no one see the storm gathering behind her eyes. But she watched. She watched Julian cross the room twice to speak with Vivienne, under the guise of discussing a mutual acquaintance, watched the practiced distance they kept between them that fooled everyone who was not looking for it. She watched the ring catch the candlelight every time Vivienne lifted her glass, a small blue flame on a woman's hand, and she thought of her mother's fingers turning the pages of a storybook, and she thought, not for the first time that year, how strange it was that a heart could break so completely and still keep beating, still keep dancing through a ballroom as though nothing at all had happened. By the time the carriage rolled home past midnight, Julian half asleep against the velvet seat with the particular slackness of the man who has had one drink too many to avoid a conversation, Margaret had already decided on her first move. She would not confront him. Confrontation was what he expected, what he had, perhaps even prepared for. A wife's tears and a husband's practiced remorse, followed by flowers and a return to comfortable silence. She would not give him the satisfaction of a scene he already knew how to survive. Instead, she would find out, quietly and completely, how a ring stolen from her mother's dressing table 2 years before had ended up on Vivienne Carrow's hand. And whatever the answer was, she suspected it would be far worse than a simple affair. Morning after the ball, Margaret rose before the household and walked the gardens alone, the way she had done every difficult morning since her mother's funeral. Frost silvered the boxwood hedges. Her breath came in pale clouds. She thought about her mother, Eleanor Whitfield, a woman who had married beneath her own family's expectations for love and never once regretted it, who had worn that sapphire ring from the day Margaret's father gave it to her until the day illness stole the strength from her hands. It had been her grandmother's before that, and her great-grandmother's before that. A piece of the Whitfield line passed mother to daughter for 4 generations, and it was meant one day for Margaret's own daughter, if she was ever to have one. The theft still sat in her memory like an unhealed wound. 2 days before the funeral, the ring had simply vanished from the small mahogany box on her mother's dressing table. The household had been in chaos, mourners arriving daily, staff stretched thin, and no one could say with certainty who had been in the room and when. The local magistrate had investigated for 3 weeks, questioned every servant, even quietly examined a traveling jeweler who had visited the house selling mourning brooches and found nothing. The case had gone cold, filed away as one more small tragedy layered atop a larger one. Margaret had cried over it once, alone, and then folded the grief into the same drawer where she kept all her other unspoken losses. Now, nearly 2 years later, that ring had reappeared on the hand of the woman sleeping with her husband, and Margaret intended to unravel exactly how. She began, as she began most things, with careful and unglamorous work. She wrote to her mother's former lady's maid, a woman named Susan Price, who had left service after the funeral to care for an ailing sister in Bristol, asking gently whether Susan recalled anything more about those final days that she had not thought important enough. She reviewed, for the first time in years, the household ledgers from that period, looking for any unusual visitor, any tradesman, any name that might connect to Vivian Caro. And she asked Mrs. and Aldous, with the discretion of a woman who had learned discretion was often the only power available to her, to quietly determine where Miss Caro had been living, and with whom, in the months before she first appeared on Julian's arm at the opera, some 14 months prior. It was Mrs. Aldous who returned first with something useful. She lodged, before she came to town, in a house near Bath, the companion reported, 3 days later, in the privacy of Margaret's morning room, with her aunt, a woman named Harriet Fenwick, and your Grace Harriet Fenwick was, for a time, employed as a seamstress to this household. Margaret set down her teacup very carefully. When? Nearly 3 years ago. Dismissed, I believe, for a minor theft of fabric. It was thought too small a matter to trouble the magistrate with at the time. The pieces did not yet form a full picture, but Margaret felt the shape of one beginning, the way a portrait emerges under a restorer's careful cleaning, dark at first, and then, slowly, unmistakably, a face. A seamstress with access to the house, dismissed for theft, and perhaps resentful of it, whose niece later became entangled with the master of that same house. It was not proof, it was a thread. But Margaret had learned, in 9 years of a marriage built more on management than affection, that threads pulled patiently enough eventually unravelled entire garments. She did not tell Julian any of what she was learning. She continued in the evenings to sit across from him at supper and discuss the tenant harvests and the state of the eastern fences, continued to appear beside him at the small gatherings where appearances were required, continued to be, to any outside eye, the composed and capable Duchess of Aldridge. But inside the walls of her own mind she was building a case, brick by careful brick, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that the work steadied her. Grief without purpose had nearly hollowed her out over the past 2 years. Grief with a direction, she was discovering, was almost bearable. It was nearly a fortnight later that Susan Price's reply arrived from Bristol, 4 pages in a careful, unpractised hand, and it was the 3rd page that made Margaret's own hands go cold. Susan recalled, now that she thought on it properly, that the seamstress, Harriet Fenwick, had, in fact, still been coming to the house in the days just before the funeral, brought in specially to alter mourning clothes for the family, despite having been dismissed some months prior. Susan had thought it odd at the time, but had been too grief-stricken and too busy to think further on it. She had seen Mrs. Fenwick alone in the upstairs hall on the very afternoon the ring disappeared, though she had assumed the woman had simply lost her way looking for the linen closet. Margaret read the letter twice, then a 3rd time, and felt something inside her chest settle into a hard, cold certainty. Harriet Fenwick had been in the house, unsupervised, on the exact day the ring vanished. And Harriet Fenwick's niece was now wearing that very ring on her hand, sleeping with Margaret's husband, laughing in ballrooms as though she had not been carrying stolen grief on her finger for 2 years. But even as the certainty formed, a smaller, more troubling question rose beside it, one Margaret could not yet answer. If Harriet Fenwick had stolen the ring out of resentment for her dismissal, why had she waited nearly a year to give it to her niece? And why give something so recognizable, so traceable, to a woman who intended to move in the very circles where its owner would eventually see it? It made no sense for a careful thief. Unless, Margaret thought, with a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air pressing against her window, the ring had not been given at all, unless it had been used deliberately as something else, entirely, a message, or a payment. She decided that same evening that she needed to speak with Vivienne Caro directly, and that she needed to do it before Julian or Harriet Fenwick or anyone else had any warning that the Duchess of Aldridge had begun asking questions. The letter Margaret sent to Vivienne Caro was 3 lines long and gave nothing away. It requested the pleasure of Miss Caro's company for tea at Faircross Hall the following Thursday, on a private matter concerning a mutual acquaintance. She did not sign it as the Duchess of Aldridge in full title, only as Monsieur Aldridge. Curious whether Vivienne would even recognize the danger folded inside such plain courtesy. The reply came within a day, accepting, written in a hand that was elegant, confident, and entirely unbothered. And Margaret understood then that whatever else Vivienne Caro was, she was not a woman easily frightened by a summons. Thursday arrived grey and quiet, rain tapping the windows of the small drawing-room Margaret had chosen deliberately, away from the grander receiving rooms where Julian sometimes entertained guests. She had dismissed the servants from the room itself, keeping only Mrs. Kong. Aldous stationed just beyond the door, close enough to hear if needed, far enough to preserve the illusion of a private conversation between 2 women who did not yet know each other well. Vivienne arrived precisely on time, dressed with restrained elegance, no jewellery but a single strand of pearls and, Margaret noted with a small, private ache, the sapphire ring on her right hand. She sat when invited, accepted tea, and studied Margaret with the frank appraising look of a woman who has spent her life being underestimated and has learned to use the underestimation as a tool. "You wish to discuss a mutual acquaintance," Vivienne said when the pleasantries had exhausted themselves. "I confess I assumed you meant your husband." Margaret had not expected such directness, and something in her recalibrated instantly. "I did not," she said, "though we may come to him eventually. I wished to discuss your aunt." Something flickered across Vivienne's face, there, and gone so quickly that a less attentive observer might have missed it entirely. But Margaret had spent 9 years learning to read the smallest movements of people who did not wish to be read, and she saw it, not confusion, but recognition. Vivienne had expected this conversation, or one very like it, though perhaps not so soon. "My Aunt Harriet," Vivienne said carefully, "raised me after my mother died. I owe her a great deal. She was dismissed from this household some 3 years ago." Margaret kept her voice level, almost gentle, the tone she might have used discussing the weather. "For theft. A minor matter. Fabric. Nothing that seemed worth involving the magistrate. And yet she returned to this house nearly a year later, brought in specially to alter mourning clothes on the very week my mother died. And on the very afternoon my mother's ring disappeared from her dressing table, your aunt was seen, alone, in the upstairs hall of this house." Margaret paused, let the silence stretch, watched Vivienne's hands tighten almost imperceptibly around her teacup. "The ring you wore to the ball last week was my mother's, Miss Caro. I would know it anywhere." I have known it since I was old enough to hold her hand." For a long moment, Vivian said nothing at all. The rain ticked against the glass. Somewhere in the house a clock chimed the half-hour, thin and distant. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its earlier polish, and what remained underneath it sounded to Margaret's genuine surprise, almost tired. "I did not know it was stolen," Vivian said. "Not until this moment. I swear that to you, Your Grace, on whatever you believe I have left worth swearing on. My aunt gave it to me 18 months ago, told me it had belonged to my mother, that she had kept it safe after her death because our family had so little else worth keeping. I wore it because I believed it was the only thing of my mother's I had left." Margaret studied her face, searching for the lie, and found to her own unease that she could not locate one. There was something in the particular quality of Vivien's stillness, the way grief sat differently on a face than deception did, that made Margaret's certainty falter for the first time since she had begun this investigation. "Then your aunt lied to you," Margaret said slowly, "or she is a far more dangerous woman than a seamstress dismissed for stealing fabric." "Both may be true," Vivian said, and something bitter moved behind her eyes. "I have wondered, more than once, how a woman living on a seamstress's modest means came to give me a ring that, fine, I told myself it was a family heirloom kept hidden through hard times. I did not wish to look too closely at a gift that felt like the only inheritance I had." She set down her teacup, her hands no longer quite steady. "You believe she stole it from your mother's own house while your mother lay dying." "I believe," Margaret said, "that your aunt was in this house, unsupervised, on the exact day it disappeared, and that the ring somehow found its way into your possession less than a year later. I have not yet decided what that means about you, Miss Carrow, but I intend to find out everything it means about her." Vivian was quiet for a long moment, and when she looked up, there was something raw and unguarded in her expression that Margaret had not expected to see, something that looked almost like relief, as though a weight she had not known she was carrying had finally been named aloud by someone else. "Then let me help you find out," Vivian said. "Because if what you believe is true, then everything my aunt ever told me about where we came from, about why we had to leave Bath so suddenly, about why she pushed me so hard toward your husband's company, all of it needs to be looked at again with clearer eyes. I have spent 2 years believing I was building something of my own. I begin to fear I have only ever been a piece someone else was moving." The rain continued outside the window and inside the small drawing room. 2 women who had every reason to despise each other sat instead in a strange and fragile alliance, both of them beginning to understand that the true shape of the injury done to them was larger and far more calculated than either had believed when the tea had first been poured. Margaret spent that night unable to sleep, turning over everything Vivian had told her, testing each piece against what she already knew. If Harriet Fenwick had genuinely stolen the ring, and if she had then deliberately placed it with her niece, knowing full well whose hand it had come from, then the theft had never simply been an act of petty resentment. It had been the opening move of something far more deliberate, though toward what end, Margaret could not yet say. Had Harriet meant all along to push her niece into Julian's path, using the ring as some strange, cruel talisman of legitimacy? Or had there been a third party involved, someone who had encouraged the seamstress toward vengeance in the first place? She thought of Julian, sleeping 2 rooms away, entirely unaware that his wife had spent the fortnight assembling a case against his mistress's family that had nothing at all to do with romantic betrayal and everything to do with something older and darker. She wondered, not for the first time, whether Julian himself had ever suspected the ring's origin, whether he had seen it on Vivien's hand and recognized it, or whether his selfishness had simply never extended to noticing jewelry closely enough to remember his own wife's mother's ring. She suspected, with a bitterness she did not enjoy feeling, that it was likely the latter. Julian noticed very little that was not about Julian. The following morning she summoned Mrs. Aldous again and asked her to make discreet inquiries into Harriet Fenwick's current whereabouts and financial circumstances. It took only 3 days for the answer to arrive, and it complicated the picture considerably. Harriet Fenwick was, according to the household steward's old records and a quiet word with the Bath solicitor's clerk, who owed Mrs. Aldous a favour from years past, living far more comfortably than a dismissed seamstress had any right to. She had purchased a small but respectable cottage outright 2 years prior, paid for, the clerk believed, in a single lump sum, and had since lived without any visible income at all. Someone paid her, Margaret said. Aldous reported this, the two women seated once more in the quiet of the morning room. Someone paid Harriet Fenwick a sum large enough to buy a cottage outright, at almost precisely the time the ring vanished. "You believe someone hired her to steal it?" Mrs. Aldous said slowly. "I believe," Margaret said, "that we have been thinking of this as a crime of opportunity when it may have been a crime of commission. Someone wanted that ring gone from this house. Someone wanted, perhaps, to see it end up exactly where it ended up, on the hand of a woman my husband would eventually take as his mistress, in a room full of witnesses who would eventually include me." She paused, feeling the shape of a suspicion she did not yet want to voice, because voicing it meant considering a betrayal larger and closer than Julian's infidelity. "The question I cannot yet answer, Mrs. Aldous, is who benefits from my discovering all of this, because someone clearly intended for me to discover it eventually. A ring that recognizable, worn in public, in circles I frequent. That is not a mistake. That is a message." Aldous's face had gone pale. "Your Grace, you cannot mean—" "I do not yet know what I mean," Margaret said, though her voice had gone very quiet, very careful, the tone of a woman standing at the edge of a realization she was not ready to fall into. "But I intend to find out, and I believe the person who can tell us is not Miss Carrow, and not even her aunt. I believe it is time I paid a visit to my father-in-law." The Dowager House at Wexcombe stood 2 hours' ride from Faircross Hall, a smaller, older manor, where Julian's father, the retired Earl of Renmore, had lived alone since his wife's death 8 years prior, tended by a skeleton staff and his own considerable pride. Margaret had always found him a difficult man, formal to the point of coldness, prone to long silences that felt more like judgments than contemplation. But he had also, in his own distant way, always shown her a particular respect he did not extend to his son. Born, perhaps, of the fact that Margaret managed Faircross Hall's finances with a competence Julian had never possessed, and old Lord Renmore. She arrived unannounced, which she knew would irritate him, and was shown into his study, where he sat by the fire with a book he was not really reading, his sharp eyes assessing her the moment she entered. Margaret. He did not rise, though it was, she thought, more age than rudeness. "This is unexpected. Julian did not mention you were travelling this way." "Julian does not know," she said, taking the seat across from him without waiting to be invited, a small act of assertion she would not have dared 2 years earlier. "I have come with questions I believe only you can answer, my lord, and I would ask that you answer them honestly, because I no longer have patience for the alternative." Something in his face changed, a flicker of wariness that told her, before she had even asked a single question, that she had been right to come. "You may ask," he said carefully. "I make no promises beyond that." "My mother's ring," Margaret said. "The sapphire, stolen from her dressing table 2 days before her funeral. It has resurfaced, my lord, on the hand of Miss Vivian Carrow, who I believe you are aware has been my husband's companion for over a year now. I have traced its path as far as a seamstress named Harriet Fenwick, dismissed from my household some 3 years ago, and paid, I believe, a sum large enough to purchase a cottage outright at almost exactly the time the ring disappeared. I have come to ask you, my lord, whether you know anything at all about who might have paid her. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Margaret began to believe he would simply refuse to answer, that his pride would win out over whatever truth sat behind his carefully composed face. But when he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its habitual coldness, replaced by something that sounded to her genuine astonishment, like weariness. "Sit back, Margaret," he said quietly. "This is a longer story than you expect, and I find, after 8 years of silence, that I am tired of carrying it alone." He told her, over the following hour, a story that reshaped everything she believed she understood about her marriage. Julian's mother, the late Countess of Renmore, had never approved of the match between her son and Margaret, not because of any fault in Margaret herself, but because she had wanted an alliance with a different family, entirely one with older money and, more importantly, closer political connections to a marriage she had been quietly negotiating for years before Julian ever met Margaret at all. The Countess had been, Lord Renmore admitted, with visible discomfort, a woman of considerable will and very little scruple when her plans were threatened. When the marriage to Margaret proceeded regardless, arranged hastily by Julian's father and Margaret's own family over the Countess's objections, she had not forgiven it, and had spent years afterward quietly working to undermine it in ways too subtle for anyone to trace back to her directly. "She hired Harriet Fenwick," Margaret said slowly, the pieces arranging themselves into a shape too monstrous to fully accept at once. "Your wife hired a woman to steal my mother's ring." "I did not know it at the time," Lord Renmore said. And for the first time in the 9 years Margaret had known him, his voice cracked slightly with something that sounded almost like shame. "I learned of it only after her death, going through her private papers, correspondence I should perhaps have burned rather than kept, though some part of me could not bring myself to destroy evidence of my own wife's cruelty without first understanding the whole of it. She believed, I think, that if she could not prevent the marriage, she could at least ensure it never became a happy one. She arranged for the ring's theft, intending, I believe, for it to eventually surface in circumstances that would humiliate you, though I do not think even she anticipated her son's own weakness would provide the exact opportunity she needed. She died before she could see any of it come to fruition. I do not know if she ever met Harriet Fenwick's niece, or arranged the connection to Julian directly, or if that part was simply cruel coincidence building upon the foundation she laid. But the ring, Margaret, the ring was hers. I have known it for 8 years and said nothing because I did not know how to say it without destroying what little peace remained in this family, and because, God forgive me, I told myself the damage was already done, and speaking of it would only reopen wounds better left closed. Margaret sat very still, feeling something that was not quite grief and not quite rage, but some dark, complicated cousin of both settling into her chest. "You let me believe it was a random theft," she said quietly. "You let me grieve it as one more small loss layered on top of my mother's death, when you knew, all along, that it was an act of deliberate cruelty aimed directly at me." "I did," Lord Renmore said, and did not look away from her, which she found, despite everything, that she respected. "It is the great failure of my life, Margaret, alongside failing to raise a son who did not repeat his mother's capacity for causing harm without conscience. I have watched Julian drift from you these past 2 years with something like despair, because I see so much of his mother in the ease with which he causes pain without appearing to notice he has done it. I did not protect you from her cruelty while she lived, and I have not protected you from his weakness since. If you have come here seeking someone to blame beyond the woman who orchestrated it and the son who has continued its damage in his own careless way, then you may blame me as well. I have earned it. Margaret rode back to Faircross Hall in silence, the carriage wheels turning over wet autumn roads, her mind working through everything she had learned, with the same careful precision she had applied to every other part of this investigation. She was not, she realized somewhere along that long ride home, primarily angry at Harriet Fenwick, who had likely been a woman desperate enough for money to accept a cruel commission without asking too many questions about its purpose. She was not even in the end entirely consumed by anger at the late Countess, a woman whose cruelty had at least the strange integrity of dying with her rather than continuing to actively wound. The anger that sat heaviest in her chest, she found, was reserved for Julian, a man who had taken a wife he did not particularly value, who had drifted toward infidelity with the same careless ease his father described in his mother, who had perhaps never even noticed the ring on his mistress's hand closely enough to recognize what it meant, because noticing would have required a kind of attention to his wife's life that he had simply never bothered to cultivate. She understood, riding home through the grey afternoon, that she had reached the end of what investigation alone could offer her. She knew now who had stolen the ring, and why, and how it had travelled from a dying woman's dressing table to her husband's mistress's hand. What remained was not a mystery to solve, but a choice to make, and it was a choice she recognized with a clarity that felt almost like relief after 2 years of quiet, drifting grief that belonged entirely to her. She did not confront Julian that evening, nor the evening after. Instead, she spent 3 days in careful preparation, meeting twice more with Vivian Carrow, whose own fury at discovering the true source of the ring and the manipulation her aunt had subjected her to burned with an intensity that convinced Margaret entirely of her sincerity. Vivian had confronted Harriet Fenwick directly, and the older woman, faced with her niece's fury and the threat of exposure, had finally admitted the whole arrangement. A payment from the late Countess's estate, funneled through an intermediary solicitor before her death, intended to place the ring eventually in circumstances that would wound Margaret as publicly as possible, with Harriet left to determine the particulars of how and when. So long as the ring eventually surfaced somewhere, Margaret would see it and understand its significance. "She told me," Vivian said, on their final meeting before Margaret made her decision, her voice still raw with the particular anger of someone who has discovered her own life was shaped by a stranger's cruelty, "that pushing me toward your husband was simply good sense, a wealthy man drawn to a beautiful woman, nothing more calculated than that. I believed her because I wanted the security, and because I told myself Julian's marriage was already unhappy before I ever entered his life, so I was taking nothing from you that you still valued." She looked down at the ring, still on her hand, and something in her expression twisted with disgust. "I did not know. I was also being used as a weapon in a scheme designed before I was even a woman he had met. I do not know how to feel about any of it, Your Grace, except that I would like, very much, to give this back to you, and to never see my aunt again, as long as I live." Margaret had taken the ring that afternoon, held it in her palm for the first time in 2 years, felt the familiar, cool weight of it against her skin, and had wept quietly and without shame, for the first time since her mother's funeral. It was not relief exactly, and not quite closure, but something adjacent to both, the particular ache of finally holding a lost piece of someone she loved while understanding fully the depth of the cruelty that had taken it from her in the first place. She called Julian to her study on the fourth evening after supper, when the household had quieted and the fires had been banked low. He came in with the mild irritation of a man who did not enjoy being summoned by his own wife, and sat across from her with the particular restlessness of someone who suspects a conversation is about to demand more of him than he wishes to give. "I have something to tell you," Margaret said, and she set the ring on the desk between them, watching his face carefully as he registered what it was. Something flickered there, recognition arriving slowly, the way understanding sometimes does in people who have trained themselves not to look too closely at inconvenient truths. "I know where it has been these past 2 years, Julian. I know who took it and why. And I know that the woman you have been keeping as your mistress wore it in public, not out of any deliberate cruelty of her own, but because she was as much a piece being moved in someone else's design as I have been." Julian's face had gone pale. "Margaret, I did not know." "I believe you," she said, and meant it, which surprised her more than it surprised him. "I believe you never noticed the ring closely enough to recognize it, in the same way you have not noticed a great many things about me these past 2 years. I do not say that to wound you, Julian, only because I think it is finally time we were both honest about the shape of this marriage, rather than continuing to perform a version of it neither of us believes in anymore." He was quiet for a long moment, his hands loosely clasped, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost its usual careless ease. "What do you intend to do?" Margaret had thought carefully over those 3 days about every option available to her. She could have chosen public scandal, exposing Julian's infidelity and the late Countess's cruelty to the same drawing rooms that had watched her dance and smile at that fateful ball, letting society's judgment fall where it would. She could have chosen quiet vengeance, using everything she now knew to destroy Julian's standing while protecting her own reputation entirely, a path that some cold, wounded part of her had genuinely considered during the worst of those sleepless nights. She could have chosen to simply endure as she had endured for 2 years, already folding this new grief into the same drawer where she kept all the others, continuing the careful management of a marriage that gave her a title and an estate, but had long ago stopped offering her anything resembling partnership or love. She chose, instead, something that surprised even herself. "I intend to separate the running of Faircross Hall from the running of this marriage," she said, her voice steady, the decision settling into place as she spoke it aloud for the first time. "You will retain your title, and I will retain mine, and the world may believe whatever it wishes about the particulars, but I will no longer perform an intimacy we do not share, nor will I continue to manage an estate whose profits fund a life I am not permitted to actually live. I have spoken with my solicitor already, Julian. My mother's fortune, which came to me and was never fully absorbed into your family's holdings, thanks to my father's careful settlement, will fund my own household at Whitfield Grange, which I intend to restore and to live in separately. You may keep Faircross Hall and Miss Carrow if she still wishes your company after learning how she was used, though I suspect, having spoken with her myself, that she no longer does. I will not divorce you because the scandal would harm both our families more than either of us deserves at this point, and because I find, surprisingly, that I do not wish to spend the rest of my life explaining myself to a society eager to judge a woman more harshly than the man who wronged her. But I will live my own life, Julian, fully and separately, starting the moment my mother's ring is back on my hand, where it belongs." Julian stared at her for a long moment, and something in his face, for the first time in years, looked genuinely uncertain. A man confronting a version of his wife he had never bothered to imagine existed beneath the composed, capable exterior he had taken entirely for granted. "You have planned all of this already," he said quietly, "before you even spoke to me." "I have spent 2 years learning that waiting for you to notice me was a poor strategy for building a life," Margaret said. And there was no cruelty in it, only a tired, hard-won honesty. "I do not say this to punish you, Julian, though I understand if you experience it that way. I say it because I have finally understood something my mother tried to teach me long before she died, that a woman's worth is not measured by how well she endures neglect, but by what she chooses to build once she stops waiting for someone else." She rose from her desk, took the ring in her hand, and slid it onto her own finger, where it settled against her skin with a rightness that felt, after 2 years of aching absence, almost like her mother's hand closing briefly over her own. The weeks that followed brought a quiet, steady transformation that Margaret had not fully anticipated when she made her decision. Whitfield Grange, her mother's childhood home, had stood largely closed since Eleanor Whitfield's marriage decades before, maintained by a small staff but never properly lived in by anyone who loved it. Margaret arrived there in early winter with Mrs. Ma, Aldous at her side, and a small household she had assembled with the same careful attention she had once given to unraveling the mystery of the ring, and found in the work of restoring a neglected house to life something that felt very much like restoring herself alongside it. Society predictably buzzed with speculation. The Duke and Duchess of Aldridge living separately was precisely the sort of scandal that filled drawing rooms for months, and Margaret bore the whispers with the same composed stillness that had carried her through every other difficult season of her life. What she found, to her genuine surprise, was that the whispers mattered far less than she had feared. She had spent so many years arranging her life around the comfort and reputation of others that the discovery of her own indifference to gossip felt almost like a second inheritance, quieter than the ring, but perhaps more valuable in the long run. Vivian Caro, as Margaret had predicted, ended her connection with Julian within a month of their conversation, though the two women continued, in an arrangement neither of them could have imagined a season earlier, a careful and cautious correspondence that had begun to resemble something like friendship. Vivian had cut all contact with her aunt, had taken a small legacy from her late mother's estate that Harriet Fenwick had apparently been managing, and had begun, with Margaret's quiet assistance, a modest new life removed from the circles that had once defined her entirely by her proximity to wealthy men. "I keep thinking," Vivian wrote in one letter, delivered to Whitfield Grange on a grey morning in early spring, "that I ought to feel more shame than I do, given how our acquaintance began. But I find instead that I am grateful in the strangest way, that a ring stolen in cruelty eventually led to the first honest friendship I have had with another woman in years. I do not know what that says about either of us, except that perhaps we were both owed something better than the lives we had been quietly settling for." Margaret kept that letter, tucked it into the same drawer where she now kept her mother's old correspondence, no longer a container for grief alone, but something closer to a record of everything she had survived and rebuilt. Lord Renmore visited Whitfield Grange twice that spring, awkward and formal as ever. But there was something new in his manner toward her, a respect that had deepened into something like genuine regard. And on his second visit, he brought with him a small box of his late wife's papers, the ones that documented the arrangement with Harriet Fenwick in full. offering them to Margaret without being asked, a quiet act of penance from a man who had finally decided silence had cost enough. "I do not know what use you will make of these," he said, setting the box on her drawing-room table with visible discomfort. "Perhaps none at all. But I found I could not keep them any longer without feeling as though I was still complicit in a cruelty I should have exposed years ago. Do with them what you think right, Margaret. I have learned, rather late in my life, that a man who protects the reputation of the dead at the expense of the living has made a poor bargain indeed." Margaret did not burn the papers, nor did she use them to publicly destroy the late Countess's memory. A woman who could no longer answer for her own actions and whose surviving family had already begun to reckon, quietly and painfully, with what she had done. Instead, she filed them away, a private record of the truth she now fully possessed, and turned her attention toward the life she was building, rather than the wounds that had shaped its beginning. By midsummer, Whitfield Grange had become something Margaret barely recognized from the closed, dust-sheeted house she had inherited. The gardens her mother had once tended were blooming again under Margaret's own careful direction. The library, long neglected, had been reorganized and restored, and Margaret spent her evenings there now, reading by the same fireplace where her mother had once read to her as a child, the sapphire ring catching the firelight on her hand exactly as it once had on her mother's. She had begun tentatively to host small gatherings of her own, women mostly, drawn from the edges of society, who had found their own lives constrained by marriages or expectations that no longer suited them, and found in Margaret's quiet, hard-won independence something worth learning from. Julian wrote occasionally stiff, formal letters concerning estate business that Margaret answered with equal formality, the two of them settling into an arrangement that resembled, more than anything, the careful, professional distance of business partners rather than the intimacy of husband and wife. It was not the marriage either of them had once imagined, standing in that garden 9 years earlier, but Margaret found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she no longer mourned the loss of that particular imagined future. She had spent 2 years grieving a marriage that had already quietly died, and the formal arrangement she and Julian now maintained felt, if anything, more honest than the performance of intimacy she had sustained in the years before she learned the truth. On a warm evening in late summer, nearly a year after she had first seen the ring catch candlelight on Vivian Carrow's hand across a crowded ballroom, Margaret stood in the restored gardens of Whitfield Grange and watched the sun set behind the old oak her mother had planted the year Margaret was born. She turned the ring on her finger, feeling the familiar weight of pearls and sapphire, and thought about everything that small piece of jewelry had come to represent. A mother's love, a stranger's cruelty, a husband's careless blindness, a stolen friendship reclaimed from an ugly beginning, and finally her own slow, deliberate choice to stop waiting for someone else to notice her worth and to build, instead, a life that reflected it plainly. Mrs. Aldous found her there as the last light faded, carrying a shawl against the evening chill, and stood beside her a long moment without speaking, the comfortable silence of 2 women who had walked through difficulty together and come out the other side. "You look at peace, your Grace," Mrs. Aldous said finally. "I feel it," Margaret said, and found the words entirely true in a way she had not expected to feel again so soon after everything the past year had cost her. "I spent so long believing peace meant the absence of pain, Mrs. Aldous. I understand now that it means something else entirely. It means choosing, deliberately and honestly, the life you actually want, rather than enduring the one you were simply handed." She looked down at the ring once more, at the sapphire holding the last of the day's light, like something that had survived against every effort to destroy it, exactly as it was always meant to. "My mother," wore this ring for 30 years, Mrs. Aldous, and she chose her own life every single day she wore it, against her family's wishes, against a society that thought her foolish for marrying for love rather than advantage. I think, perhaps, this is the first year I have finally understood what she was trying to teach me all along, that a woman's choices are the truest inheritance she can leave behind, far more lasting than any ring, however beautiful, however dearly bought. The garden settled into evening around them, the last birds calling from the old oak, the first stars emerging faint and steady overhead, and Margaret Aldridge, Duchess in title and, at last, fully herself in practice, stood in the home her mother had loved and felt, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, entirely and completely at peace with the life she had chosen to build.